No one showed up to the birthday party. Not because they forgot, but because they didn't know how to look at two girls in wheelchairs without feeling uncomfortable. The Hale mansion stood on a quiet stretch of Upper East Side stone and glass, 3 stories tall, floor-to-ceiling windows glowing against the cold March evening. The kind of place magazines call powerful and neighbors call intimidating. Inside, a 12-foot marble island held a pink and silver birthday cake topped with 10 delicate candles, each flame steady beneath the hum of central air. Emma Hale and Eleanor Hale sat side by side in matching ivory dresses, their identical pale faces reflecting the candlelight, their hands resting softly in their laps, motionless but graceful. The ballroom had been decorated with helium balloons tied in perfect symmetry, a custom banner arching across the far wall, and a long table lined with untouched party favors that cost more than most families spend on groceries in a week. Yet the chairs remained empty. The invited classmates' parents had sent polite emails that afternoon, unexpected plans, last-minute trips, sudden fevers that arrived conveniently at 3 p.m. Upstairs, Victoria Hale stood in her home office staring at a glowing screen filled with numbers, stock graphs climbing in sharp blue angles, investors waiting for her final approval on a merger worth 9 figures. At 38, she had built Hale Biodyne from a startup in a rented Brooklyn loft into a biotech powerhouse valued in the billions. She negotiated contracts like a chess master, measured risk in percentages and trusted data over emotion. But down the hall beyond the silence, her daughters waited for footsteps that didn't come. Emma glanced at the doorway every few seconds. Eleanor leaned slightly toward her sister, whispering, "Mom's still in a meeting." The candles burned lower wax, bending gently, and the room felt bigger by the second, as if the space itself knew that wealth could fill square footage, but it could not fill a single empty chair. Upstairs, Victoria Hale muted the conference call for exactly 10 seconds and pressed her fingers against the bridge of her nose as if she could steady the entire world with that small gesture. The city skyline stretched beyond her office windows, taxis threading through traffic 5 stories below, horns softened by double-insulated glass, the pulse of Manhattan constant and indifferent. On her desk sat a framed photograph taken 3 summers ago in the Hamptons, Emma and Eleanor laughing in matching sun hats, their father kneeling behind them with his arms wrapped carefully around their shoulders. She had not moved that frame in 4 years. She had simply stopped looking at it. Her assistant's voice echoed faintly through the speaker, reminding her that investors in Chicago were waiting for confirmation before markets opened in the morning. Numbers mattered. Timing mattered. Reputation mattered. She unmuted the call and delivered her decision in a calm, precise tone that never trembled, even when her eyes drifted toward the hallway, where silence lingered too long. Downstairs, Emma watched the candle flames flicker lower, her reflection trembling in the glossy marble countertop. Eleanor shifted slightly in her chair, the soft motor humming for half a second before going still again. The air smelled like vanilla frosting and helium. The grandfather clock near the staircase ticked loudly enough to measure disappointment in seconds. Outside, headlights swept briefly across the tall windows as cars passed without slowing. Emma whispered, "Do you think Mom forgot the time?" Eleanor forced a small smile and said, "She never forgets anything." But the candles were bending now, thin lines of smoke curling upward as wax pooled at the base, and the space between hope and reality felt wider than the distance from the ballroom to the office upstairs. The candles finally gave in one by one, thin threads of smoke rising into the vaulted ceiling, as if even the flames understood when to stop trying. Emma watched the last light disappear and felt the room grow heavier, not darker, but quieter, like a theater after the audience has left. Eleanor tilted her head toward the staircase, listening for the sharp rhythm of their mother's heels on hardwood, the confident stride that usually filled the house with authority. There was nothing. Only the steady ticking of the grandfather clock and the distant murmur of Victoria's voice upstairs, faint through layers of walls and ambition. A catering assistant stood awkwardly near the kitchen entrance, checking her phone, unsure whether to approach or vanish. The event planner had already texted an apology and left citing an emergency downtown that no one bothered to verify. The balloons drifted slightly toward the ceiling vents, ribbons twisting gently in air that felt too cool for celebration. Emma swallowed and said softly, "Maybe we should wait." Eleanor nodded, though her eyes had grown glassy. Waiting had become a skill, almost a discipline. Waiting for physical therapy appointments. Waiting for new treatments that promised hope. Waiting for their mother to finish saving the world before coming back to save the evening. Upstairs, Victoria signed the final document digitally, her name appearing in crisp electronic ink, worth more than most people earn in a lifetime. Applause filtered through her headset from men in tailored suits hundreds of miles away. She allowed herself a controlled breath, then closed her laptop with decisive calm. For a brief second, the silence that followed felt louder than any boardroom. And downstairs, 2 10-year-old girls sat beside a cake that had already cooled their birthday, measured not in presents or laughter, but in minutes that stretched longer than the hallway between them and their mother. The doorbell rang at exactly 7:23 in the evening. Sharp and unexpected, echoing through the marble foyer like a sound that did not belong in a house this controlled. Victoria paused halfway down the staircase, one hand resting lightly on the polished banister, her expression tightening as if unscheduled moments were personal offenses. The catering assistant hurried to the door and opened it to reveal a man in his late 30s, standing beneath the porch lights, holding a black equipment case in one hand and a folded invoice in the other. He wore dark jeans, work boots dusted lightly with city grit, and a navy jacket with the name Brooks Audio Solutions stitched over the chest. Beside him stood a boy, around 9 years old, sandy hair, slightly messy, a backpack slung over one shoulder. Eyes wide as he took in the mansion's towering columns and 12-foot ceilings. The man cleared his throat politely and said his name was Daniel Brooks, explaining that the original sound technician had canceled, and the agency had called him last minute to repair the wireless speaker system that had apparently failed earlier in the afternoon. Victoria descended the remaining steps with measured grace, her heels clicking against marble, and informed him that the event was nearly over. Daniel glanced past her shoulder toward the ballroom where 2 small figures sat beside a cake that had already lost its glow. He did not stare at the wheelchairs. He noticed the untouched presents instead. Noah, his son, shifted his weight and whispered, "Dad, is it still a party?" Daniel offered a small, steady smile and said quietly, "If there is cake, there is still time." Victoria hesitated, calculating inconvenience against optics, then stepped aside with a curt nod. The cold air from outside followed them in briefly before the heavy door closed, sealing the house once more. As Daniel set his equipment case down near the silent speakers, he sensed something heavier than technical malfunction in the room, something no manual could troubleshoot, and for the first time that evening, the stillness felt like it was about to change. Daniel knelt beside the sleek wireless speaker tower positioned near the ballroom wall, unsnapping his case with quiet efficiency, while Noah wandered a few careful steps behind him, sneakers whispering against polished marble. The house felt too pristine for children, like a museum arranged for display instead of living. Daniel tested a cable connection and listened to the hollow pop of static, then glanced again toward the twins. Emma met his eyes, first curious but cautious, while Eleanor studied Noah's backpack as if it held secrets from another world. Noah offered a small wave, the kind that did not demand attention but invited it. Victoria stood near the edge of the room with her arms folded lightly, observing everything the way she observed quarterly reports, searching for inefficiencies. Daniel adjusted a frequency dial, and soft instrumental music suddenly spilled into the space, gentle piano notes filling corners that had only known silence all evening. The sound was not loud, just enough to soften the edges. Emma's shoulders lifted slightly. Eleanor's lips parted in surprise. Noah stepped closer to the cake and said, "It still looks good to me." Victoria inhaled as if about to intervene, but Daniel spoke first, his tone calm and respectful. He asked the girls if they had made a wish yet. Emma glanced at the thin trails of smoke that still lingered above the cooled wax, and said they had been waiting. Daniel nodded, as though waiting were the most natural thing in the world. He turned to Victoria and asked without accusation if he could relight the candles. The request hung between them, simple yet unfamiliar. Victoria hesitated, unused to strangers adjusting moments inside her carefully structured life. After a measured pause, she gave a slight nod. Daniel handed Noah a lighter from his kit, and together they leaned forward, one steady hand guiding a smaller one, bringing flame back to wick. As the candles flickered alive again, the room shifted, not dramatically, but enough to remind everyone present that sometimes all it takes to restart a celebration is someone willing to kneel down and try. The candlelight reflected in Emma and Eleanor's eyes small golden sparks that made the vast ballroom feel less like a showroom and more like a place meant for breathing. Daniel remained kneeling, not rushing, the moment his voice gentle as he asked the girls what they wanted to wish for this year. Emma looked at her sister before answering, as if decisions were always shared, and said she wished for something different. Eleanor added softly that different would be nice. Noah leaned in closer, resting his elbows carefully on the marble island without touching the cake, and asked what different meant. Emma hesitated, then admitted that sometimes different meant not feeling like everyone was afraid to say the wrong thing. The honesty hung in the air, fragile but clear. Victoria felt the words land heavier than any market fluctuation ever had. She stepped forward, her posture still composed, yet something in her expression had shifted from authority to uncertainty. Daniel glanced up at her briefly, not challenging, simply present, and said quietly that birthdays were not about perfection, they were about showing up. The statement was not directed at anyone yet. It reached exactly where it needed to. Victoria exhaled slowly and moved beside her daughters, smoothing a strand of hair from Eleanor's forehead with a tenderness she rarely displayed in public. Daniel suggested they count together before blowing out the candles again, and this time he positioned a long silver straw near the flames, while Noah held it steady. On the count of 3, Emma and Eleanor inhaled as deeply as they could and exhaled through the straw, their combined breath bending the flames until one flickered out, then another, until the final candle surrendered. The room filled with the faint scent of extinguished wax and something else, something warmer. Noah clapped without hesitation, and Daniel followed the sound, echoing softly against marble and glass. For the first time that evening, laughter rose without effort. Victoria watched the scene unfold, realizing that the merger she had just secured would make headlines by morning. But this small, unplanned intervention might be the only thing anyone in the room would remember years from now. The applause faded gently, but the warmth it created did not disappear as quickly. Daniel stood and brushed a faint trace of dust from his jeans, glancing toward the speaker system, as if reminding himself why he had been called in the first place. The soft piano continued in the background, steady and understated, no longer an intrusion, but a quiet companion to the room. Noah asked if they could sing, and without waiting for formal permission, he began a slightly off-key version of Happy Birthday, his voice clear and unembarrassed. Emma joined, first her tone light, but determined, and Eleanor followed a second later, their harmonies imperfect yet genuine. Victoria hesitated only a moment before adding her own voice, controlled at first, then gradually less restrained. Daniel completed the circle, his deeper register grounding the melody. For a brief stretch of seconds, the mansion no longer felt cavernous. It felt lived in. When the song ended, Noah grinned and declared that every birthday needed music loud enough to shake the ceiling at least a little. Daniel adjusted the volume just slightly higher enough to bring a soft rhythm into the air without overwhelming conversation. Emma asked Noah what he liked to do for fun. He told her about pickup basketball at the community center 3 blocks from their apartment in Queens, about summer afternoons, when the asphalt radiated heat through the soles of his sneakers, about how his father always rebounded for him even after long workdays. Eleanor listened carefully and said she liked painting landscapes, especially oceans she had only seen in photographs. The contrast between city courts and imagined shorelines bridged something invisible between them. Victoria watched from only a few feet away, feeling both gratitude and discomfort. Gratitude because her daughters were smiling wider than they had all evening. Discomfort because a stranger had created that shift in less than 20 minutes. Daniel noticed her expression and offered a small nod that carried no judgment. Outside, another car slowed briefly near the curb, headlights lingering against the tall windows before moving on. Inside, the music continued, but beneath it ran a subtle tension, the awareness that moments like this could be fragile, and that not every problem in a room this large could be solved with a lighter and a song. The cake was finally sliced, neat triangular pieces placed carefully onto porcelain plates trimmed in silver. Noah carried 2 plates at a time with exaggerated seriousness, as if he had been entrusted with something priceless, and delivered them to Emma and Eleanor with a small bow that made them laugh again. Frosting brushed lightly against Emma's fingertip, and she grinned at the sweetness as though it had surprised her. Daniel accepted a slice only after Victoria insisted his thanks quiet but sincere. For a few minutes, the conversation flowed easily, simple topics about school subjects, favorite colors, and whether winter in New York felt longer than it should. Then the question came without warning. Noah asked why the other kids did not show up. The room shifted almost imperceptibly. Emma stared down at her plate. Eleanor straightened slightly in her chair. Victoria's hand tightened around her fork before she placed it down with deliberate calm. Silence returned, not as heavy as before, but edged with truth. Emma answered first. Her voice steady yet small, saying that sometimes parents worry their children will say the wrong thing. Eleanor added that sometimes people think different means fragile. Daniel listened without interruption, his expression thoughtful rather than pitying. He said quietly that different also meant strong in ways others might not understand yet. Victoria felt the words reach somewhere guarded inside her. She had spent years building a company devoted to medical innovation, chasing breakthroughs measured in clinical trials and percentages. Yet she could not control how playground conversations unfolded or how invitations quietly disappeared. A soft vibration buzzed from her phone resting on the counter. She glanced down and saw a notification from a media outlet requesting comment on the merger, along with a message from her public relations director suggesting a staged photo opportunity with the girls tomorrow to humanize the announcement. The timing felt almost cruel. She locked the screen without replying. Across the room, Emma looked up at Daniel and asked if his son ever felt left out. Daniel hesitated for only a second before admitting that sometimes he did, but that they handled it together. The word together lingered in the air, simple and unpolished, carrying more weight than any strategic plan Victoria had ever approved. The word together seemed to settle into the marble and glass, like something that might stay if no one rushed to erase it. Emma rolled her chair a few inches closer to Noah, studying him with open curiosity. She asked what it felt like to run full speed across a basketball court. Noah thought for a moment, then said it felt like wind pushing against your face and sneakers squeaking loud enough to echo off painted brick walls. Eleanor closed her eyes as if storing the description for later building an image from borrowed experience. Daniel watched the exchange with quiet attentiveness, aware that children often asked the most direct questions adults avoided. Victoria stood at the island, her posture still upright, but her defenses no longer sharp. She realized she had spent years shielding her daughters from discomfort by controlling environments, curating guest lists, and managing optics, yet she could not manufacture genuine connection. Another notification lit up her phone, this time from a business news network, announcing that her merger had officially broken records for the quarter. Congratulations poured in from colleagues who had never met her children. The contrast pressed against her chest. Across the ballroom, the catering assistant quietly finished packing untouched trays into insulated carriers, the soft click of lids snapping shut marking the end of a celebration that had nearly dissolved. Daniel glanced at his watch and mentioned that they should probably head back to Queens before it grew too late. The words carried no expectation, only practicality. Emma's smile faded slightly. Eleanor asked if they would see each other again. Noah answered before his father could, saying they could meet at the community center sometime, maybe paint a mural or find a way to adapt a game so everyone could play. The suggestion felt simple, almost naive, yet it filled the room with a possibility larger than the house itself. Victoria stepped forward, then her voice steady but less guarded than before. She thanked Daniel for staying, for relighting more than just candles. He responded that sometimes showing up was not complicated, it just required choosing to stay a little longer than planned. As he gathered his equipment case, the front doorbell rang again, this time, accompanied by the unmistakable flash of headlights lingering outside. Through the tall windows, silhouettes of camera crews became visible on the sidewalk, lenses pointed toward the mansion, as if drawn by instinct to moments of public triumph. Victoria felt the fragile warmth of the evening collide with the reality waiting beyond her front steps, and for the first time in years, she was not certain which world she was prepared to face first. The flashes outside multiplied, brief bursts of white light streaking across the tall windows and reflecting against polished marble like distant lightning. The catering assistant froze near the kitchen entrance, uncertain whether to continue packing or disappear entirely. Daniel instinctively shifted closer to his son, not alarmed but protective, while Noah stared toward the front door with open curiosity. Emma's fingers tightened around the edge of her chair. Eleanor looked toward her mother, searching for instruction in her expression. Victoria felt the shift immediately, the seamless transition from private moment to public spectacle. Her phone vibrated again, with urgent messages from her public relations director, advising her to step outside and capitalize on the record-breaking merger while media attention was at its peak. The wording was efficient, strategic, calculated. None of it mentioned the two girls still sitting beside a half-eaten cake. Victoria moved toward the windows and parted the curtains slightly. At least 4 news vans were parked along the curb, satellite dishes angled toward the sky, reporters adjusting microphones, camera operators framing the entrance as though expecting a triumphant walkout. She understood how quickly narratives formed. Female chief executive officer secures historic deal while raising 2 daughters with courage. It was a headline ready to print. Behind her, Emma asked softly if the lights were for them. The question landed harder than any criticism ever had. Victoria turned back into the room and saw the contrast clearly for the first time. On one side, polished headlines and financial victory measured in billions of dollars. On the other, 2 10-year-old girls who had waited through silence just to share a song. Daniel watched her with steady awareness, saying nothing, offering no advice. The decision belonged to her. Noah stepped closer to Emma and Eleanor and whispered that sometimes cameras made things look bigger than they felt. The piano music continued in the background, almost drowned out by the muffled hum of generators outside. Victoria inhaled slowly, feeling the weight of years spent proving she could handle everything alone. She realized that stepping outside would be easy. It was the role she knew. Remaining present inside in this imperfect and unplanned celebration required something different. The doorbell rang again, longer this time, deliberate. Reporters called out her name through the closed door, their voices faint but persistent. Emma looked toward her mother with uncertainty. Eleanor's voice trembled slightly as she asked if the party was over. Victoria crossed the room and knelt in front of her daughters, eye level, her voice steady, despite the noise beyond the walls. She said the party was not over until they decided it was. And outside, the cameras kept rolling, waiting for a story they did not yet understand. Victoria remained kneeling in front of her daughters, even as another wave of light flashed across the windows, her reflection briefly splitting across the glass like 2 separate versions of herself. One version knew exactly how to walk through the front door, lift her chin, and deliver a statement that would dominate the morning news cycle. The other version felt the fragile pulse of this room, the warmth that had only just begun to breathe. Emma searched her mother's face as if reading for clues. Eleanor's hand trembled slightly against the armrest of her chair, not from fear of the cameras, but from uncertainty about what mattered more. Daniel stood a respectful distance away, his equipment case closed. Now his posture steady and unassuming. He understood crossroads without needing them explained. Noah leaned quietly beside him, eyes shifting between the windows and the cake, as though trying to measure the size of the decision unfolding. Victoria's phone rang this time, not a vibration, but a direct call. The name of her public relations director glowed across the screen. She did not answer. Instead, she placed the phone face down on the marble island. The gesture was small, but it felt irreversible. Outside, reporters called her name again, louder urgency sharpening their tone. She rose slowly and walked toward the front door, each step measured. Emma's voice stopped her halfway. She asked if her mother was going to leave the party. The question carried no accusation, only honesty. Victoria turned back and crossed the distance to her daughters once more. She said she would speak to the reporters, but she would not let them define this night. She promised she would return before the music ended. Daniel stepped forward, then his voice calm but firm, offering to stay until she came back inside. It was not a heroic declaration. It was simply a choice to remain present. Victoria met his eyes for a moment longer than necessary, recognizing something rare in his steadiness. She moved toward the door again and placed her hand on the handle. The cameras outside shifted lenses, adjusting anticipating spectacle. She opened the door just enough to step onto the stone threshold, the cold March air brushing against her skin. For the first time in years, she did not begin with numbers or achievements. She began by saying that tonight was about her daughter's birthday, and inside the mansion, Daniel quietly turned the music up one notch higher, as if preparing the room to hold whatever came next. Cold air wrapped around Victoria as she stepped fully onto the stone walkway, the heavy front door closing behind her with a controlled click that separated two worlds. Microphones lifted immediately, camera lenses narrowing in sharp focus, bright lights washing the front of the mansion in artificial daylight. Reporters began speaking over one another, questions about the historic merger, about market impact, about how she balanced executive leadership with motherhood. Victoria raised one hand slightly, not demanding silence, but requesting space. Her voice, when it came, was steady and lower than usual, stripped of presentation polish. She said that tonight was not about financial milestones. She said that tonight was about two 10-year-old girls inside that house who had waited patiently to celebrate turning another year older. The cameras shifted subtly, recalibrating the narrative in real time. A reporter asked whether she planned to use her daughters as part of the company's public image moving forward. The question landed with the bluntness of strategy disguised as curiosity. Victoria felt the instinct to respond with controlled phrasing, yet something in her softened instead. She said her daughters were not branding tools. They were children who deserved joy without an audience measuring it. A brief murmur rippled through the crowd. Inside, through the tall windows, Emma and Eleanor could see their mother's silhouette framed by light. Eleanor whispered that she looked different. Emma nodded, sensing the change without needing it explained. Daniel stood near the island with Noah, listening to the muffled cadence of Victoria's voice beyond the glass. He did not move toward the door. He remained where he was needed. Outside, another question cut through the air, asking whether the company's success felt ironic, given that it focused on medical innovation, while her own daughters still relied on wheelchairs. For a moment, the night stilled. Victoria inhaled slowly and answered without defensiveness. She said innovation was not a guarantee of miracles. It was a commitment to keep trying. She said progress did not erase personal struggle. It simply made hope possible. The words were not rehearsed. They were honest. Inside, Emma reached for Eleanor's hand. The piano music continued softly anchoring the room. Victoria concluded by saying she would answer further questions tomorrow at the office, but tonight she was returning to finish a birthday celebration. She stepped back from the microphones before they could redirect the conversation, turned, and walked toward the front door. As she crossed the threshold again, leaving the glare behind, she carried no press release in her hands, only a quiet understanding that the real work of her life had never been measured in stock prices at all. When Victoria stepped back inside, the silence that greeted her felt different from the one earlier that evening. It was no longer empty. It was waiting. The heavy door closed behind her, muting the distant murmur of reporters into a dull echo that no longer controlled the air. Emma and Eleanor were watching her, as if she had just returned from somewhere far more dangerous than a stone walkway. Daniel stood near the marble island, one hand resting lightly on the back of Noah's shoulder, not intruding, simply anchoring the room. Victoria crossed the distance slowly, her heels softer against the floor than before. She stopped in front of her daughters, and for a moment she did not speak. The polished executive composure she had worn for years felt misplaced here, like a suit tailored for the wrong occasion. Emma broke first, asking if the cameras were gone. Victoria shook her head gently and said they were still outside, but they could wait. Eleanor searched her mother's face and asked why people cared so much about business, but not about birthdays. The question was not bitter. It was honest. And honesty can cut deeper than accusation. Victoria felt something inside her finally give way, not in collapse, but in release. She knelt again, eye level, her voice unguarded. She admitted that she had spent years believing that if she built something powerful enough, it would protect her daughters from every stare, every whisper, every absence. She said she thought success would create a shield. Instead, it had built walls. Emma's eyes filled not with sadness alone, but with recognition. Eleanor reached forward and placed her hand over her mother's, a small, steady pressure that said more than comfort ever could. Daniel looked away respectfully, giving privacy to a moment that did not belong to him, yet he remained close enough to step in if needed. Victoria continued, her voice trembling for the first time that night. She said she was sorry for every meeting that ran too long, for every time she chose a headline over a bedtime story, for believing that providing everything meant being present enough. The words echoed softly through the ballroom, heavier than any corporate announcement. Emma whispered that she did not need everything. She just needed her. The simplicity of it shattered whatever distance remained. Victoria leaned forward, carefully wrapping her arms around both daughters, mindful and tender, holding them not as responsibilities to manage but as children to love. The piano music still played in the background, steady and low, but now it felt like a heartbeat rather than decoration. Daniel met Noah's eyes and gave a small nod as if to say this was the moment that mattered. Outside, cameras waited for another statement. Inside, a mother finally allowed herself to stop performing and start listening, and the shift in the room was so profound, it felt almost visible, like light bending in a new direction. Victoria did not let go quickly. She held Emma and Eleanor as if she were relearning the exact shape of them, the weight of their shoulders, the quiet rhythm of their breathing against her chest. Years of controlled posture dissolved into something softer, something human. The marble floor beneath her knees did not matter. The cameras outside did not matter. For the first time in a long time, the only measure of success was whether her daughters felt seen. Emma pressed her forehead gently against her mother's shoulder and whispered that she used to pretend the board meetings were dragons and that one day her mother would defeat them and come home early. Eleanor admitted that she sometimes kept her paintings unfinished, so she would have something new to show if her mother had a free minute. Each confession was small, innocent, and devastating in its clarity. Victoria closed her eyes as if absorbing every word into memory. She realized that ambition had never been the enemy. Distance had been. Daniel shifted slightly near the island, giving the family space while remaining present enough to steady the room. Noah watched quietly, no longer restless, sensing that this was not a moment for noise. The piano music ended, leaving behind a silence that felt sacred rather than empty. Victoria lifted her head and looked at her daughters with resolve that was different from corporate determination. It was not about conquering markets. It was about changing patterns. She told them that starting tomorrow, she would restructure more than a company. She would restructure her time. She said she would attend physical therapy sessions in person, not through reports. She would read every new chapter of their favorite books herself. She would make birthdays impossible to ignore. Emma searched her face for doubt and found none. Eleanor smiled slowly, cautiously hopeful. Daniel stepped forward, then not to interrupt, but to steady the practical world again. He reminded Victoria gently that the reporters were still outside, and that stories, if left uncontrolled, often grew sharper overnight. Victoria stood wiping a single tear without embarrassment. She thanked him not formally, but with quiet gratitude that carried weight. She walked to the island, picked up her phone, and instead of calling her public relations director, she recorded a short message herself. She spoke directly into the camera, explaining that tonight had reminded her why innovation mattered not for headlines, but for families who needed real progress. She posted it without filters, without staging, without rehearsal. Then she placed the phone down and turned back to the room. The battle outside could wait. The transformation had already begun inside. Within minutes, the message Victoria posted began spreading faster than any prepared press release ever could. Notifications lit up her screen in rapid succession, not with market analysis, but with parents sharing their own stories with families, describing hospital corridors and long therapy sessions with strangers, thanking her for choosing honesty over polish. Outside, the tone of the reporters shifted. Through the tall windows, the camera crews could be seen lowering their equipment slightly, some scrolling through their phones as they watched her unfiltered video circulate in real time. The narrative had changed, not because of strategy, but because of truth. Inside the mansion, the atmosphere felt lighter, as if the air itself had expanded. Emma asked what people were saying. Victoria read a few comments aloud, voices of mothers in Ohio, fathers in California, teachers in Texas, all expressing gratitude for a leader who admitted she did not have all the answers. Eleanor listened carefully and then said that maybe different did not mean fragile after all. Daniel watched the exchange with quiet approval, understanding that public perception could pivot in a single authentic moment. His phone buzzed as well, a message from a friend who had just seen the video and recognized the mansion in the background. He silenced it without checking further. This night did not belong to notifications. Victoria walked toward him, gratitude clear in her expression. She admitted that if he had not stayed, if he had not relit those candles, she might have walked outside earlier and delivered the speech everyone expected. Daniel shrugged lightly and said sometimes the most important decisions happen when someone simply refuses to leave. Noah stepped closer to Emma and Eleanor and asked if they wanted to see the community center someday. Emma's eyes brightened. Eleanor nodded with quiet excitement. Victoria looked at Daniel, the unspoken question hanging between them about whether their worlds could intersect beyond this evening. Before anything could be answered, the front doorbell rang again, but this time the tone felt less intrusive. Victoria opened the door halfway. One reporter stood alone, no camera crew behind her, asking respectfully if she could quote the video message instead of pressing for more. Victoria agreed with calm assurance and then closed the door fully. The cameras began packing up outside. Inside, the music resumed softer now, almost like a lullaby. Victoria returned to her daughters and said that next year the guest list would look different. Emma smiled and replied that maybe it already had. And in the quiet glow of a house no longer defined by emptiness, a celebration that nearly disappeared became the beginning of something none of them had planned, yet all of them had needed. By the time Daniel gathered his equipment case again, The mansion no longer felt like a stage set for appearances. It felt lived in, imperfect, and warm. Victoria walked him and Noah toward the foyer, the marble floors reflecting softer light now that the camera trucks outside had mostly dispersed. Through the tall glass panels, only a few distant headlights remained the spectacle reduced to ordinary city traffic. Emma and Eleanor rolled alongside them, unwilling to let the night end without intention. Noah promised he would bring a basketball with signatures from his friends next time, and Emma countered that she would trade him one of her ocean paintings once it was finished. Eleanor added that maybe they could design something together, a mural that showed both waves and city courts, proof that different worlds could share a wall. Victoria listened to the children negotiate future plans with a calm she had not felt in years. At the door, she turned to Daniel and asked if he would consider coming by the office later that week, not for publicity, but to talk about accessibility initiatives the company had discussed, but never truly prioritized. Daniel hesitated only briefly before agreeing, making it clear that he would speak honestly if he came. Victoria nodded, welcoming the condition. Honesty had already changed the trajectory of her evening. As the door opened, cool night air slipped inside once more, but it no longer carried tension. Daniel thanked her for trusting a stranger enough to let him stay. Victoria replied that sometimes strangers saw what insiders missed. Noah waved one last time, and Emma called out that next year the candles would not need relighting because the room would already be full. The door closed gently behind them, and the house settled into a quieter rhythm. Victoria stood still for a moment, absorbing the absence of cameras, the absence of urgency. She walked back into the ballroom and noticed the half-empty plates, the slightly crooked banner, the faint wax drips on the marble island. None of it bothered her. She asked the catering assistant to leave the decorations up overnight. Emma and Eleanor asked if they could watch a movie before bed, something simple and light. Victoria agreed without checking the time. They arranged themselves in the living room, blankets pulled close, the glow of the television softer than the flash of any camera. As the opening credits rolled, Victoria sat between her daughters, one arm around each of them, and allowed the weight of the day to settle without resistance. Outside, Manhattan continued its restless motion. Inside, something had finally slowed. And in that slowing, a new foundation quietly began to take shape. Morning arrived with a different kind of brightness, sunlight filtering through the tall windows, without the intrusion of flashing cameras. Victoria woke earlier than usual, not because of an alarm tied to global markets, but because she wanted to be present before her daughters opened their eyes. She walked into the kitchen in soft house slippers, brewed coffee without checking her phone, and watched the city move at a distance that no longer felt urgent. When Emma and Eleanor rolled into the kitchen, still wrapped in the comfort of sleep, they found their mother already seated at the table with 3 plates of pancakes arranged unevenly, imperfect circles that made them laugh. Victoria admitted she had not cooked in years without assistance. Emma declared that imperfect tasted better. After breakfast, instead of retreating to her office, Victoria accompanied her daughters to their scheduled physical therapy session in Midtown. The rehabilitation center smelled faintly of disinfectant and determination, long hallways lined with parallel bars and therapy mats. Therapists greeted Victoria with polite surprise, accustomed to updates delivered through assistants. This time, she remained observing every stretch, every measured movement, every effort that required patience beyond spreadsheets. She asked questions not as an executive searching for efficiency, but as a mother seeking understanding. Across town, Daniel received a call from Victoria's office requesting a meeting later that week to discuss accessibility investments and community partnerships. He listened carefully, agreeing to attend only if the conversation extended beyond public relations value. When he hung up, Noah asked if that meant they would see the twins again. Daniel answered that meaningful change often begins with uncomfortable conversations, and he believed Victoria was ready for one. Back at the rehabilitation center, Emma completed an exercise that had frustrated her for months. Eleanor managed a slight increase in flexibility that earned applause from her therapist. Victoria witnessed both victories firsthand, small but profound, and she realized progress was rarely dramatic. It was consistent presence. That afternoon, she drafted an internal memo announcing a restructuring of corporate priorities, allocating significant funding toward long-term mobility research and community accessibility programs rather than short-term investor optics. Some board members responded with cautious concern. Victoria responded with clarity that felt newly grounded. When she returned home that evening, she did not head to her office. She joined her daughters in the living room where paint supplies were spread across a protective tarp. Together, they began sketching a mural concept that blended city skylines with rolling ocean waves. The lines were uneven, the colors bold and imperfect, but as Victoria dipped a brush into blue paint and added her own stroke to the canvas, she understood that transformation was not a headline. It was a habit built one deliberate choice at a time. A week later, Daniel walked into the glass tower that housed Hale Biodine with the same steady posture he had carried into the mansion, though the surroundings were different. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the Hudson River conference tables stretched 20 feet long, and screens displayed data in precise columns of blue and white. Victoria greeted him not from behind a desk, but at the entrance to the boardroom, sleeves rolled up, no entourage trailing her. Several board members sat already waiting, their expressions reserved, curious about the contractor who had somehow influenced corporate direction. Daniel spoke plainly, describing the gaps he had witnessed in public spaces, the subtle exclusions that never made headlines but shaped daily life for families navigating mobility challenges. He did not use polished language. He used examples: ramps that ended in steps, elevators that were out of order for months, community centers without adaptive programs. Emma and Eleanor were not present yet. Their reality anchored every word. Victoria listened without interruption, occasionally nodding, occasionally jotting notes in the margin of her tablet. When a board member questioned the financial return on such large investments, Victoria answered before Daniel could. She said return should not be measured only in quarterly growth, but in expanded access and long-term trust. She proposed the creation of a foundation funded directly by company profits dedicated to mobility research and community accessibility grants nationwide. The room fell quiet, calculations shifting from resistance to possibility. By the end of the meeting, the proposal passed with cautious approval contingent on measurable milestones. Victoria accepted the condition with calm certainty. Later that afternoon, she drove with her daughters to the community center in Queens that Noah had described. The building was modest brick walls, weathered by years of city seasons, a basketball court echoing with the squeak of sneakers. Noah met them at the entrance, holding a ball signed in bold marker. Daniel stood beside him, pride tempered by humility. Emma and Eleanor rolled onto the edge of the court, observing the game before Noah suggested a new variation that allowed everyone to participate. Daniel and Victoria worked together to adjust positioning, improvising with cones and lighter passes, laughter replacing hesitation. The mural concept they had sketched at home found its first public wall, their waves stretching across brick, beside a painted skyline, colors bright against aged surface. Community members gathered, curious, then supportive. Victoria watched her daughters engage not as symbols, but as children among peers. Daniel caught her glance across the court, a silent acknowledgement of distance traveled in such a short time. What began as a nearly empty birthday had grown into collaboration, into movement that extended beyond one evening. And as the sun dipped lower over Queens, casting long shadows across the painted waves, Victoria understood that leadership at its best was not about standing above others. It was about kneeling when needed and rising together. Months passed, and the rhythm of the Hale household no longer echoed with absence. The foundation launched quietly, at first funding adaptive equipment for community centers in 3 states, then expanding as stories spread. Emma and Eleanor attended ribbon cuttings not as mascots, but as advisors in small sneakers and bright ideas, pointing out details adults often overlooked. Victoria traveled less and listened more, scheduling board meetings around therapy sessions instead of the other way around. Headlines still appeared, but they carried a different tone, now less about dominance and more about direction. On a mild spring afternoon, nearly 1 year after that birthday, the mansion doors stood open again. This time, the guest list included children from the community center, therapists, engineers, neighbors, and yes, Daniel and Noah. The ballroom felt transformed, not because it was fuller, but because it was honest. The cake sat on the marble island once more, candles waiting patiently. Emma glanced at Eleanor and smiled with confidence rather than uncertainty. When the singing began, it was loud and imperfect voices overlapping in joyful chaos. Victoria stood behind her daughters, hands resting lightly on their shoulders, not controlling the moment, simply present within it. Daniel caught her eye from across the room, and there was no grand declaration needed. They both remembered the silence of the previous year, the nearly extinguished light, the stranger who chose to stay. As Emma and Eleanor leaned forward together, their breath steady and strong, the candles went out on the first try, no relighting required. Applause filled the space, echoing off marble and glass, but this time it did not feel like performance. It felt like belonging. And in that shared laughter, Victoria understood that the most powerful merger of her life had never been corporate at all. It had been the joining of courage and presence, of ambition and heart woven together in a house that finally sounded like home. Later that evening, after the last guest had left and the balloons drifted lazily toward the ceiling, the house settled into a comfortable quiet that no longer felt hollow. Wrapping paper lay scattered across the living room rug, bright evidence of celebration rather than absence. Emma and Eleanor compared their favorite gifts, debating which thank you notes to write first, their voices animated and certain. Victoria sat on the floor with them, her dress slightly wrinkled hair no longer perfectly styled, and she did not rush to fix any of it. Daniel and Noah lingered near the doorway, preparing to head back to Queens, but in no hurry to escape the warmth. Victoria walked them out, not with formality, but with familiarity. On the front steps, under a soft glow of porch lights instead of camera flashes, she thanked Daniel again, not for a single evening, but for the ripple that followed. Daniel answered that he had only said what felt natural at the time. Victoria smiled and replied that sometimes natural courage changes everything. Noah promised Emma and Eleanor that next weekend they would continue painting at the community center, adding new waves to the mural. The girls agreed enthusiastically, already planning colors. As the car pulled away, Victoria remained on the steps for a moment, breathing in the cool night air. There were no reporters, no urgent notifications, no competing narratives. Just the distant hum of Manhattan and the faint laughter drifting from inside her own home. She turned back through the open door and found her daughters waiting for her to join them on the couch for one last movie scene before bed. She switched off her phone without hesitation and crossed the room, choosing again what mattered most. And as she settled between them, the glow of the screen reflected softly across three faces that no longer feared being overlooked. Long after the movie ended and the city lights dimmed beyond the tall windows, Victoria stood alone for a moment in the quiet hallway outside her daughter's bedrooms. The house no longer echoed with distance. It carried traces of laughter, faint music, and the soft hum of possibility. She stepped into Emma and Eleanor's room to find them already drifting towards sleep, a sketch of ocean waves resting on the nightstand between them. Victoria brushed a gentle kiss against each forehead, lingering just long enough to memorize the calm in their breathing. Downstairs, her phone remained untouched on the kitchen counter screen, dark markets, closed headlines, paused. In another part of the city, Daniel tucked Noah into bed in their modest apartment, promising that next week they would check on the mural's progress. The worlds they inhabited were still different in size and scale, but no longer divided by misunderstanding. They were connected by a moment that had once seemed small. Victoria returned to the living room and stood by the same marble island where candles had nearly burned out a year earlier. She ran her fingers lightly across the surface, remembering the silence, the hesitation, the choice to stay. Success had once been measured in square footage and revenue charts climbing upward. Now it was measured in shared dinners and therapy sessions, attended in birthday candles, extinguished by confident breath. She understood that she could still lead a company, still pursue innovation, but never again at the cost of presence. Outside Manhattan continued its restless rhythm, taxis weaving through midnight traffic windows glowing across the skyline. Inside the mansion felt grounded, no longer a monument to achievement, but a home shaped by intention. And somewhere in that stillness, the echo of a simple promise lingered, not about what one person could do alone, but about what became possible when someone said, without hesitation, that they could face it together. Did this story move your soul? Share your feelings in the comments and rate it from 1 to 10. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Then tap the bell icon so you never miss a new story. Click the end screen to watch another heartfelt video. See you in the next story.